Hip flexors.
Yeah.
Let's do it. Jordan's like, what, bro? Jordan, where are we? How long have we been? Do you feel like we've just been here for like eternity? You ever get that feeling you've been in one spot so long?
Yeah, like it's still the same day it was this morning.
Yeah. And it just goes on, and you start to think to yourself, like, where was I ever that wasn't here?
It's like Groundhog Day.
Yeah, oh, dude, Bill
One
Murray's
of
the
my
fucking
favorite
shit.
movies. When he gets sick of the one guy and he like steps in the puddle and punches him in the face. Mwah.
What's cracking, guys? Omar Isaf here, back with another video. We got the main man himself, Jordan Shallow. How you doing?
Yeah, good.
You're like, I'm better. It's 3 a.m. It's 3 a.m. Yeah. But you had a seminar here at Fortis. You dropped some straight knowledge, like some things that honestly I had never considered before. One of the interesting ones is people always refer to the hip flexors, but there's more than one hip flexor. And how they stretch it in the first place is incorrect. And this is relevant for those that want to squat, want to lift weights in general. It's a very common area that is stretched, but people just say the hip flexor. And the first thing you're like, nah, that's
Which
wrong.
one?
Yeah, you're like, which one?
Yeah, so people think it's just very linear, right? They just think hip flexor, just pure hip flexion, knee to chest. You know, sat like we are today. It's kind of ironic that we sat down for this one because we are in a passive hip flex position, which is usually the underlying root cause to a lot of hip flexor issues. But we need to understand that anytime we deal with that ball and socket joint, there's going to be multiple planes of movement we work in at once. So rarely are we just going through straight linear hip flexion without some intonation of adduction internal rotation, abduction external rotation. So that mindset, when we go into extending the hip, extending and stretching those flexors, we need to also think about, are we going to abduct or adduct in that extended position to sort of act on different muscles that will flex the hip. So this hip flexor is just a designation of a movement, but we got to think of the muscles that comprise that movement, their anatomy, and then their secondary and tertiary actions when attempting to stretch it.
So without further ado, let's actually get into the way then you stretch the hip flexors.
So most people assume that the hip flexor is one muscle that works in one plane, right? Just linear flexion. And to stretch it, we're just going to do the opposite. Just get it into extension. That'll address the hip flexor. But the hip flexors are a lot more than that. It's a designation of muscle groups responsible for a range of motion, not just through a single plane, because we have to remember the hip is a ball and socket joint, right? So every time we have an origin or insertion point that acts on that joint, it's going to have some play, sure, in flexion, but also with rotation or adduction or external rotation and abduction. So when we extend the hip, we don't just want to go into straight extension. We want to go through extension in varying degrees of internal and external rotation, abduction and adduction to address not just the hip flexor, but the hip flexors. So all the muscles that are going to flex the hip. So what I want you to do, we're going to find ourselves a squat rack. We're going to anchor that rear leg. So sort of drive that ankle into the side of a rack. Now, first, we're going to start sort of at 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock. We'll start off to the side. And now what we're going to do, we're going to leave this hip into extension, but it's now going to be locked into a position of abduction and external rotation. So as we sort of sink down into that lunge, we're going to get sort of a different sensation of a hip stretch than we usually get because of that consideration for the other ranges of motion of hip flexion that we're now stressing in a different range of motion in hip extension. So you can start all the way out, and the idea is just work your way around the clock. So this is sort of the conventional model, this 12 o'clock, this straightforward. So we sort of just sink forward into that knee, keep the pelvis in neutral. Now this is where it gets tricky. Now we're gonna come across and sort of shoot for 3 o'clock. So we're gonna leave this rear extended hip in relative internal rotation and adduction. So we're gonna move our pelvis around a fixed femur head and sort of lunge into this position now. So square the shoulders up, bring the sternum right over the knee as we lunge forward, and you'll feel sort of the front of that hip start to unwind. These are some of your secondary and tertiary flexors of the hip now in extension. So we just sort of unravel that, hold that stretch, and then slowly start to work your way around the full sort of, half dome of that clock face, right? And we're gonna work different degrees of hip extension. So that's kind of the goal of hip flexor stretching as it pertains to stretching all the hip flexors, not just a linear extension of the hip opposing one hip flexor.
Oh, guys, that is the video. That's all the time we have. My thanks to Jordan for being on this channel. Anything you want to say in closing?
No, that was it. I mean, just the takeaway from this is like anytime we're dealing with a ball and socket joint, linear movement's out of the question, right? So we got to think of that, the secondary action, the tertiary action, because we are dealing with that ball and socket, whether that's hip, whether that's shoulder, just putting a little bit more deeper thought into sort of other potential players in the movement, whether that's stretching, whether that's strengthening. Look sort of down that rabbit hole of secondary, tertiary action, you get a lot more out of your stretching, a lot more out of your stability, and a lot more out of your training.
Dude, makes complete sense. If you're not subscribed to Jordan already, subscribe to his channel. He's uploading at least one time per week. And you're doing a great job. Honestly, I think for those that are interested in this type of knowledge, you have already, I think, almost 50 videos, different topics, doing only more. I think this type of information is not nearly conveyed often enough, so I think it's a very unique niche. Subscribe, check out his channel. If you liked the video, if you liked this video, you enjoyed it, like the damn video, and we'll be seeing all you guys, my rascals, in that next video. Peace.